Mayor Thaddeus Crowley raised his hand to strike the young bride he had bought at auction. 70 men in that Wyoming saloon held their breath. Nobody moved, nobody dared, and then the doors blew open and four mountain men nobody had seen in 9 years stepped out of the cold. Pull up a chair, friend. Let me tell you how it happened. The wind that blew down from the Wind River Range that October night carried something more than cold. It carried the smell of wood smoke and old blood of pine sap frozen on bark of horses lathered from hard riding. It carried the sound of a piano playing badly in the Golden Spur Saloon of Laughter that had nothing to do with joy of boot heels on warped pine floors. And somewhere out beyond the last lamps of Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory, on a ridge where no man had walked in 3 winters, that wind carried the soft breath of four brothers who had not yet decided whether they would come down off their mountain. It was the 14th of October, 1882, and it was the day a young woman named Marigold Ashcombe stepped off a stagecoach with one trunk, one folded letter, and one prayer that the man waiting for her would be kind. She would not get her prayer, but she would get something better. She just did not know it yet. They called it ordinary business. The men of Bitter Creek thought themselves clever, the kind of clever that comes when a town has gone too long without a man to answer to. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley, with his oiled mustache and yellow teeth, had decided to put a 22-year-old orphan girl on the auction block in his own saloon to settle a debt. They laughed when she stood there shaking. They placed wagers on which one of them would have her by morning. They imagined her shame the way men do when they have forgotten what shame feels like themselves. But they did not know Ezekiel Thorncroft. They did not know Bartholomew Thorncroft. They did not know Cornelius Thorncroft. And they certainly did not know Josiah Thorncroft, the youngest, the silent one, the boy who had not spoken a full sentence aloud in 18 years. Sometimes the stone you throw away is the diamond you spend the rest of your life looking for. Pull up a chair, friend. Let me tell you how it happened. Now, folks, before I take you any further, do me a small favor. If you love these old frontier tales, hit that like button right where you are. Tells the algorithm to share this story with men who need to hear it. That is all I will ask of you tonight. From here on out, it is just you, me, and the campfire. Now then, 3 days before that auction high in the Hawthorne Valley where no map showed a road, Ezekiel Thorncroft sat alone at a kitchen table built from a single split slab of white pine. He was 32 years old. He stood 6'7" in his stocking feet. He had a scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheek to the corner of his jaw, a scar a grizzly had given him 5 winters back when the bear had come up out of a thicket near Yellowstone and tried to take him into the next world. The bear had not succeeded, but it had taken something all the same. It had taken his face as he had once known it. And not long after them, it had taken the only woman he had ever loved. That morning, his hands shook a little as he lifted his tin cup of bitter chicory coffee to his mouth. It was not fear. Ezekiel Thorncroft had not been afraid of anything in 5 years that he could put a name to. It was the memory of last January. The fever had come on him slow at first, a heaviness behind the eyes, a sickness at the bottom of the stomach. By the 3rd day, he could not stand. By the 5th, he could not lift his own head from the bunk. Bartholomew was 2 valleys west chasing a wounded elk. Cornelius was running his trap line 40 miles to the south. Josiah, sweet, silent Josiah, had ridden down to the Birchwood place to fetch the old man for help. But a sudden blizzard had locked the passes for 9 days. For 10 days, Ezekiel lay alone in that cabin with a fever that turned his dreams into a kind of slow drowning. He remembered, though he tried not to, the moment in the worst of it when he had whispered into the dark of an empty room a question that no man should have to ask alone. Who, he had whispered, will find my body? He had survived. By the grace of God and a constitution made of iron and pine pitch, he had pulled through. But something had changed in him during those 10 days. Something a man does not get back. Across the table, Bartholomew Thorncroft watched his brother in the firelight. Barrett, they called him, the brother who had ridden 2 years with the 7th Cavalry and come home with eyes that did not always see what was in front of them. He was 30 years old. He was big as Ezekiel, but quicker, leaner, the kind of man who could draw a Colt Navy revolver from his hip and put 6 rounds inside a tin can at 20 paces before the can hit the dirt. His left hand sometimes shook when he reached for a spoon. It never shook when he reached for a gun. "You've been quiet, brother," Barrett said. Ezekiel set the cup down. "I've been thinking." "That's so. I am 32 years old." "I know how old you are, Zeke. Next year I am 33. Barrett let a small smile touch the corner of his mouth. He was the only one of the four who could pull a smile out of his older brother on the bad days. That is generally how it works. Ezekiel did not smile back. He looked into the fire a long time. Then he said the thing he had been holding inside his chest for weeks. "A man cannot live like this forever, Barrett. A mountain does not forgive a man who tries to live alone forever. I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of dying and nobody knowing, nobody finding me. The cabin standing empty come spring with the door open and the wind blowing through." Barrett did not answer right away. He understood his brother in the way only a man who has buried his own ghost can understand another man. "You thinking about a wife, Zeke?" "I am thinking about not being the last man on this mountain when my time comes." Foreshadowing whisper 1. Ezekiel Thorncroft did not know it yet, but in 3 days' time the wind would bring something to his door he had not dared ask for in a prayer, and it would arrive wrapped in a navy blue traveling dress with cornflower blue eyes and a name that meant the gold of a flower. Outside, the youngest brother stood on the porch with a charcoal pencil in his hand and a leather sketchbook balanced on the porch rail. Josiah Thorncroft was 25 years old. He had not spoken a full sentence aloud since he was 7 years old, since the night he had been hiding in the root cellar with his brothers, while their mother was dying upstairs, and a piece of him had simply broken off and never come back. He could grunt. He could sing under his breath when he was alone with the horses. He could whisper a single word now and again. But the long, flowing speech of ordinary men was a country he had not entered since. He was drawing the moon. The third brother, Cornelius, called Neil, was somewhere down by the corral checking the lead rope on the gray draft cross. He was 27, slender as a willow-whip, the best tracker any of them had ever seen, and the only one of the four who could not read a printed word. The brothers carried their wounds the way other men carry pocket watches, quietly, without complaint, but each one carried a wound just the same. Now, meanwhile, 140 miles east of that cabin on a stagecoach, grinding its way through the broken country south of Cheyenne, a young woman sat with a folded letter in her lap. Her name was Marigold Ashcombe. She was 22 years old. Her hair was the color of clover honey gathered in a modest knot at the nape of her neck, with soft tendrils escaping around her temples in the way of girls who had once been pretty and who did not yet know that hardship had only made them prettier. Her eyes were a clear cornflower blue. Her skin was porcelain pale, the kind of pale that comes from too many winters indoors over a sick bed and a counter. She wore an elegant traveling dress in deep navy wool fitted in the bodice, with small lace at the cuffs and collar, a small cameo brooch at her throat. The dress was dusty from 4 days of travel. The brooch was the only thing of her mother she still owned. She was traveling toward a man whose name on the letter was Mr. Henry Caldwell. She had never met him. She had only the letter, and the letter, written in a careful copper-plate hand, had promised her the following things: a house with a stove and a real glass window, a husband who would treat her with Christian kindness, a small parlor where she might keep her mother's china teacup and the silver pocket watch that had been her father's, a new beginning in a place where nobody knew that her parents had died of cholera in 1879, that her uncle Edmund Ashcombe had then been her only living kin, and that Edmund himself had died in some terrible accident in the Wyoming high country only 6 months past, leaving her with nothing in the world but his debts. The letter had also promised her safety. Across the coach from her sat an older woman in a black bombazine traveling dress, a widow on her way to bury a sister in Rawlins. The woman had been watching Marigold for some time. "Child," the widow said at last, May I ask you a question that is none of my business? Yes, ma'am. Where are you bound for? Bitter Creek, ma'am, to meet my future husband. The widow's face did not change much, but something behind her eyes did. And have you met this future husband of yours, child? Only by letter, ma'am. He is a businessman in Bitter Creek, a man of standing, the mayor, in fact. The widow looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked out the coach window at the empty buffalo grass rolling past brown and silver under a sky the color of pewter. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. Child, a decent man does not need to send for his wife by mail. Marigold did not answer. She held the letter tighter in her gloved hand. She did not want to hear what the widow was saying. She had nowhere else to go and no money to go anywhere with, and the letter was the only thing in her possession that promised her she would not freeze to death in a Boston alley before the year was out. So she said nothing, and she looked out at the grass and she pretended she had not heard. The widow did not press her. The widow simply reached across the coach and took Marigold's small gloved hand in her own veined one, and she held it for a long minute without speaking. Then she let go. Foreshadowing whispered too, there are kindnesses in this world a person does not understand until much later. Marigold Ashkman would remember that old widow's hand on hers for the rest of her natural life. She would remember it on cold nights, on the hardest nights, on the night she stood in a frozen valley with a rifle heavier than her own arms and made a choice that ended one man's life and saved another's. The coach rolled on into evening. The widow got off at a way station near Rock Springs and never came back. By the time the coach pulled into Bitter Creek the next afternoon, Marigold was alone again with her trunk, her letter, and a feeling under her ribs like a small bird trying to get out of a fist. The stagecoach office in Bitter Creek was nothing more than a clapboard shack with a hitching rail. There was no Mr. Caldwell. There was instead a tall, thin man wearing a tin star and a sour expression. He introduced himself as Sheriff Mortimer Pratt. He told her that Mr. Caldwell had been delayed on business and would meet her that evening at the Golden Spur Saloon, where a private parlor had been arranged. A saloon, she said. The sheriff smiled without warmth. The Golden Spur, ma'am, is the finest establishment in Bitter Creek. There is no need to take that tone. She did not take any tone. She had been raised better than that. She allowed Sheriff Pratt to load her trunk into a wagon and drive her down the muddy main street of Bitter Creek, past a cluster of unpainted buildings in a livery stable, in a small white church that looked as though it had not heard a true sermon in years. The sheriff helped her down at the Golden Spur Saloon and tipped his hat and rode away, and Marigold Ashcombe walked through those swinging doors carrying her own trunk because there was no one to carry it for her. The room inside fell quiet when she entered. Hook moment one. Now, folks, you have to understand something about Bitter Creek in the autumn of 1882. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley owned this town the way a hawk owns a chicken yard. The sheriff worked for him, the judge worked for him, the bank worked for him. Even the preacher in that little white church had long since sold his soul to keep the doors open. When Marigold Ashcombe walked through the doors of the Golden Spur Saloon, she was not walking into a parlor. She was walking into a trap that had been baited for her name. And the only 4 men in 500 miles who could pull her out of that trap were sitting around a kitchen table 2 days' ride to the west talking about loneliness. The Golden Spur Saloon was a long, low room, thick with the smell of stale tobacco and cheap rye and unwashed men. There were maybe 40 patrons inside. There was a piano in the corner with most of the ivory peeled off the keys. There was a long mahogany bar dark with old spilled liquor. Behind that bar stood a woman in her 60s with iron gray hair pulled tight in a bun and a face that had seen every kind of trouble a frontier town could manufacture. Her name was Hattie Jenkins. She was the proprietor. And when Marigold Ashcombe walked through the door, Hattie Jenkins looked up and something passed across the old woman's face that no one else in the room saw. Recognition, pity, and something harder underneath both. A man stepped down from a poker table at the back of the room. He was about 55 years old, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a black wool suit, cut a little too fine for a Wyoming saloon. He wore a heavy gold watch chain across his vest. His mustache was oiled to two sharp points. His teeth, when he smiled, were the color of old corn. He had pale eyes that did not smile when his mouth did. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "welcome to Bitter Creek. I am the man you have been writing to." She set her trunk down. She kept her chin up the way her mother had taught her. "Mr. Caldwell," he smiled wider. "Among other names, yes. Allow me to formally introduce myself. I am Mayor Thaddeus Crowley. The Caldwell name was a small fiction necessary for our correspondence. You will forgive me, of course, when you understand the circumstances." She felt the blood leave her face. She felt the room change around her. She felt 40 pairs of male eyes turn slowly toward her where she stood with her trunk at her feet. "I do not understand," she said. "You will," Crowley said. "Sit down." She did not sit down. She did not move at all. Crowley produced a leather portfolio from inside his coat and laid it on the bar. He opened it slowly, the way a man opens a coffin lid. Inside lay a stack of promissory notes tied with red string. He picked them up and held them out to her. "These are the debts of your late Uncle Edmund Ashcombe. $5,000 exact. I have purchased every one of them. Under the laws of Wyoming Territory, ma'am, the closest living kin of a debtor may be held responsible for the unpaid balance. A woman without funds may work off such a debt, or if she chooses, she may discharge the debt through marriage to her creditor." He smiled at her with those yellow teeth. "I am giving you the dignity of a choice, Miss Ashcombe. Most men in my position would not. The wedding will take place tomorrow morning. Reverend Goss has been informed." For a moment, Marigold could not speak. The room had grown so silent she could hear the piano player breathing. Then she said very quietly, "I will not marry you, sir." The whole room seemed to lean forward at once. Crowley laughed. It was a soft laugh, almost gentle the way a man laughs when a child says something foolish. "My dear young woman, you are not in a position to refuse. You are alone, you are penniless, and you are $5,000 in debt to me personally. There is no train back to Boston. There is no telegram to wire. There is only this room and me and the law of the territory. Now, we can do this with grace, or we can do this without." He took a step towards her. He reached out and laid his thick hand on her upper arm. Through the wool of her sleeve, she could feel the shape of his fingers, and she understood for the first time in her life what kind of man she was looking at and what kind of life had been planned for her behind that letter. She did not cry. She did not beg. She just stood there with her chin up and her father's silver pocket watch clutched white-knuckled in her right hand. Micro cliffhanger. Now you might think this is where the four mountain men come crashing through the door. They do not. Not yet. Because the truth is, friend, the four mountain men did not yet know she existed. The wind that would carry her name to them was a wind that had not yet started blowing. Tonight, Marigold Ashcombe was going to have to survive on her own with no help but her wits and the kindness of one strange old woman behind a bar. Hattie Jenkins put down the glass she had been polishing. She walked out from behind the bar with the easy authority of a woman who has thrown larger men than Thaddeus Crowley out of her saloon for less. "Mayor," Hattie said, "you will let go of that girl's arm. You will let go of it now. You are not married to her yet. And until that piece of paper is signed, this is my saloon, and she is my guest, and you will not lay your hand on her under my roof." Crowley's smile did not falter, but his fingers loosened from Marigold's arm. "Hattie, you have always been a sentimental woman. And you, Thaddeus, have always been a small one. Now step back." He stepped back. There were certain people in that town who could face down Mayor Crowley, and Hattie Jenkins was one of them because Hattie Jenkins had buried 2 husbands and run a saloon for 30 years, and there was nothing left in this world that frightened her, except perhaps the sound a coffin makes when the lid finally closes. Hattie turned to Marigold. "Child, come behind the bar with me. You will sleep upstairs in my own room tonight. You will eat at my table, and you will do nothing tomorrow morning until I have had time to think on the matter. Mayor Crowley can wait one day for his bride. The Lord himself waited 6 for the world. The room snickered nervously. Crowley's pale eyes went a shade colder. One day, Hattie, one day. I am a patient man, but I am not a forgiving one. Nobody here ever accused you of being forgiving, Thaddeus. Now sit down and have a drink. I will pour it on the house. He sat down. The men in the saloon went back to their drinking slowly, one table at a time, with the low buzz of 100 whispered theories already starting to move through the room. Hattie put her arm around Marigold's shoulders and walked her toward the back stairs. When they were in the small room upstairs with the door shut and a chair wedged under the latch, Hattie turned to Marigold and put both hands on her cheeks the way a mother does. Listen to me, child. Listen close. I have got one night to save your life. You will sit on that bed and you will drink this cup of tea I am about to bring you, and you will not move from this room until I tell you. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am, but what? Why are you helping me? Hattie Jenkins looked at the girl for a long moment. Then she said something that did not just then make any sense at all. Because 30 years ago, child, I had a sister named Mary, and she had 4 little boys. And I owe those 4 boys a debt I have been waiting 18 years to pay. Now sit down, I have got a letter to write. Hook moment 2. Folks, sit with that for a minute. Hattie Jenkins, 60-year-old proprietor of the Golden Spur Saloon, just told that scared girl she had 4 boys to think of. 4 boys. And the night was just beginning. Because while Marigold sat in that locked upstairs room with a cup of cooling tea in her hands, Hattie Jenkins was downstairs at her bar writing a letter. And that letter was about to be carried by a bought rider on a fast horse into the highest crags of the Wind River Range, to a cabin where 4 brothers were sitting by a fire, talking about loneliness. The wind was about to start blowing. It just had not gotten there yet. Hattie wrote 3 lines on a folded piece of brown paper. She sealed it with a drop of candle wax. She walked out the back door of the saloon to the livery stable where a young half-breed boy named Toby was waiting. She put $20 in gold into his palm, which was more money than he had ever held in his life, and she put the letter in his coat pocket. She said, "Boy, you ride straight through the night. You do not stop. You go up the Sweetwater Trail to Big Pine Gap, then west along the ridge to the Second Creek, and you put this letter in the hand of a man named Ezekiel Thorncroft. You give it to nobody else. You die before you give it to anyone else. You hear me, Toby?" Toby nodded. He swung up on a tough little buckskin horse. He was gone into the dark before the saloon doors stopped swinging. Hattie went back inside. She poured herself a small whiskey and drank it standing at the bar. Mayor Crowley was watching her over his cards. She raised her glass to him pleasantly. He raised his. Neither of them smiled. The night rolled on. Out on the ridge, the wind began to rise. 2 days later, in the high mountains, a horse came up the last switchback before the Hawthorne Valley, with steam pouring off its flanks and a half-frozen boy slumped over its neck. Cornelius Thorncroft saw the horse first because he saw everything first. He came out from the corral with his Winchester loose in his hand, low, the way a man carries a rifle when he has not decided yet whether to use it. Behind him in the cabin doorway, Ezekiel appeared, and behind Ezekiel came Barrett with his coat half on. Josiah was already on the porch. Josiah always knew when something was coming. He had known for an hour. Toby fell off the horse into the snow. Neil caught him. The boy was blue-lipped, his eyes glazed, but he had the letter in his fist, and he would not let it go, even when Barrett pried his fingers open one at a time. The letter was in Hattie Jenkins' hand. The Thorncroft brothers had not seen Hattie's handwriting in 9 years, but they all knew it on sight, especially Ezekiel. He read the 3 lines on the porch with his brothers crowded around him. He read them once, he read them twice. Then he folded the paper carefully and put it inside his coat over his heart, and he looked up at his 3 brothers, and his pale blue gaze had something in it the brothers had not seen since the night their mother died. He said, "Saddle the horses, all 4. We ride at dawn." Barrett said, "Where to?" "Bitter Creek." Neil whistled low. "Zeke, we have not been to Bitter Creek in 9 years. We are going tonight. Hattie has called us down. There is a girl. What girl? Ezekiel handed the letter to Barrett. Barrett read it. His face changed. Barrett handed it to Neil, who could not read, but who understood from his brothers' faces that something had broken loose in the world. Neil handed it silently to Josiah, who could read perfectly well, even though he could not speak, and Josiah read it, and Josiah's fingers tightened on the porch rail until the knuckles went white. The letter said three things. The first thing was a name, Marigold Ashcombe. The second thing was a sentence. She is Edmund's niece. The third thing was four words underlined twice in Hattie's heavy hand. They have her now. Twist one. Folks, hear me. Edmund Ashcombe was not just any man. Edmund Ashcombe had been Ezekiel Thorncroft's secret partner for 3 years. The two of them had found something in the high country in 1879 that was not yet on any map. They had found a vein of quartz so thick with gold that the rock itself seemed to be made of it. They had found the find of a generation. They had agreed that Edmund, the only honest assayer in 500 miles, would file the claim under a blind trust to protect them both from the men who would kill them for it. 6 months earlier, in April of 1882, Edmund had not died in any accident at South Pass. Edmund had been ambushed and shot in the back by Mayor Thaddeus Crowley's men because he had refused to turn the deed over. The Thorncroft brothers had known this for 6 months. What they had not known until that letter was that Edmund Ashcombe's niece had finally come west, and Mayor Crowley had her. By midnight, the four brothers were saddled. By midnight, they were riding down the ridge at a pace that no man rides at midnight in the high country unless he has decided that the price of his own life is no longer the most important price on the table. Ezekiel rode point. Barrett rode behind him, his Colt Navy oiled. Neil rode third, carrying the heavy Sharps 50 caliber buffalo rifle. Josiah rode last, silent as smoke, with a long knife in his belt and a pencil sketch of the moon folded inside his shirt next to his heart. In a saddlebag on the lead horse, Ezekiel carried a heavy canvas sack. Inside that sack lay 73 ounces of raw gold from the high vein. He had pulled the sack from a hiding place under the floorboards of the cabin without saying a word. He did not need to say a word. All four brothers knew what the gold was for. 73 ounces of gold at $16 an ounce came out to a hair under $1,200. That was nowhere near $5,000. So when Barrett finally spoke halfway down the ridge, he said only one thing. Zeke, that gold is not enough. Ezekiel did not turn his head. It is not for the debt. Then what is it for? It is for the bar. It is to get her out of the saloon. The debt we will settle the other way. Barrett did not ask what the other way meant. He knew what it meant. They all knew. There were certain ways the Thorncroft brothers had of settling debts that did not involve money, and those ways did not get talked about in daylight. They rode through the night. They rode through the next day. They rode without stopping except to water the horses. By the second night, they were on the high country above Bitter Creek, looking down at the little smudge of yellow lamps in the dark, and Ezekiel reined his horse in and turned to his three brothers under a sky thick with cold stars. One last word before we ride in, he said. Whatever happens in that town tomorrow night, we walk in together. We walk out together. We do not draw first. But if any man in that saloon lays a hand on Edmund's niece, we end him where he stands. Are we understood? Barrett nodded. Neil nodded. Josiah, who had not spoken aloud since he was 7, opened his mouth, and in a voice rusted from 18 years of silence, he said one single word. Aye. The other three brothers looked at him. None of them said anything. There are some things you do not comment on in a man's life, and the moment a brother who has not spoken in 18 years chooses to speak again is one of them. They rode down off the ridge at the gray of false dawn. Now back in Bitter Creek, while the brothers had been riding, Marigold Ashcombe had been living through the longest 5 days of her young life. Hattie Jenkins kept her upstairs through the first 4 days. Crowley sent word twice. He sent flowers. He sent a dressmaker who could not quite hide her own pity. He sent finally a small velvet box containing a wedding ring that had once belonged to his grandmother and that he expected the bride to wear at the ceremony the following morning. Hattie accepted all of it at the door with a tight smile and then put it all on a shelf and did not bring any of it upstairs to Marigold. But on the fifth day, Crowley grew impatient. He sent Sheriff Pratt up the back stairs with two deputies and a piece of paper. The paper said that Miss Ashcombe was to be brought downstairs at 6 o'clock that evening for a public reading of the marriage banns and a community celebration in advance of the wedding. The paper said that if Hattie Jenkins refused to comply, she would be arrested for harboring a debtor in flight from her lawful obligations. Hattie read the paper. She read it twice. Then she looked at Sheriff Pratt and said, "Mortimer, you have known me for 27 years. Look me in the eye when you tell me you are doing this." The sheriff could not look her in the eye. "It is the law, Hattie. It is Crowley's law, Mortimer. It is not God's." 6 o'clock, Hattie, have her downstairs. He left. Hattie went upstairs. She sat on the bed next to Marigold, and she took the girl's small hands in her own scarred ones, and she said, "Child, I am going to tell you something now, and you are going to listen, and you are not going to be afraid. We are going to walk you downstairs at 6 o'clock. You are going to stand in that saloon and with your chin up the way your mother taught you. You are not going to cry. You are not going to beg. You are going to wait. Do you understand?" Wait for what? For the door, child. For the door. Marigold did not understand, but she nodded, because Hattie's eyes had something in them that held her up the way nothing else in this world had held her up since her father had died. At 5:45, Hattie helped her into a clean gray wool traveling dress, the navy blue one having been soiled past wearing by the 4 days on the road, and pinned her honey blonde hair in a simple knot and put her mother's cameo at her throat. At 6 o'clock exactly, the two of them came down the stairs together, and the saloon went silent. It was packed wall to wall, maybe 70 men. Crowley was at the center on a small wooden platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting somebody had nailed up in a hurry. Reverend Goss stood beside him with a Bible and a hangdog expression. The piano was silent. Every face in the room turned toward the staircase. Hattie walked Marigold to the bottom of the stairs and stopped. She did not lead her any further. She took one step back, and she stayed there, her hands folded in front of her apron, her face a stone. Crowley smiled with all of his yellow teeth. "Miss Ashcombe, come forward." Marigold did not move. "Miss Ashcombe, do not embarrass yourself." Marigold lifted her chin. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she lifted her chin. "I will not marry you, Mayor Crowley. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever." The saloon held its breath. Crowley's smile faded by degrees like a candle dying. His pale eyes went very still. He stepped down from the platform. He walked across the floor toward her, slowly, one boot heel ringing on the warped pine boards at a time, and the room watched him the way a room watches a snake cross a floor. He stopped in front of her. He raised one hand, and he was going to do something then, friend, that I will not describe in this telling, because it does not need to be described. You know what kind of man he was. You know what he was about to do, but he did not get the chance. Because at that exact moment, the swinging doors of the Golden Spur Saloon blew open with a violence that snuffed half the lamps in the room. The cold wind rolled in like a wave of black water. With it came the smell of pine resin, of hard travel of wolf pelt, of wood smoke, of horses run nearly to death. Standing in the doorway framed against the dark of the street and the last red light of evening were 4 silhouettes. Tall, massive, heavy with leather and fur. Each one of them broader at the shoulders than any man in that saloon. The one in front stood 6'7" and had a scar running down the left side of his face. The one to his right was leaner and had 2 Colt Navy revolvers low on his hips. The third was slender as a willow, holding a long, heavy buffalo rifle across his arm. The fourth and youngest stood half a step behind the others in absolute stillness, and his eyes in the lamplight were the eyes of a man who has seen the world end once already and is in no particular hurry to see it end again. The room did not breathe. Somebody somewhere in the back of the saloon whispered three words: Ghost, Brothers, Thorncroft. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley turned slowly from Marigold to the door. The hand he had raised dropped to his side. The color in his face dropped with it. The tallest of the four men in the doorway took one step into the saloon. The floorboards groaned under his boot. His mountain-colored eyes did not look at Crowley, did not look at Pratt, did not look at any of the men in that room. His eyes went directly to the trembling young woman in the gray dress at the bottom of the stairs. He said in a voice rusted by years of silence, the only sentence he had come down the mountain to say: "Miss Ashcombe, Hattie Jenkins sent us." Reverend Ross on the platform was crossing himself silently and looking very much like a man who would in an hour's time be on a horse out of Bitter Creek for good. Hook closing part 1. And right there, friend, on the warped pine floor of the Golden Spur Saloon in Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory, on the evening of the 19th of October, 1882, the door that Hattie Jenkins had told Marigold to wait for had just opened. The four Thorncroft brothers were inside the room. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley was 3 steps from a girl he had thought he already owned. 70 men were watching. A canvas sack of high country gold was about to land on Hattie's mahogany bar with a sound nobody in that saloon would ever forget. The four Thorncroft brothers stood in the doorway of the Golden Spur Saloon, and the saloon stood still around them. Ezekiel Thorncroft took one more step inside. His eyes had not yet left the trembling girl at the foot of the stairs. He saw her hands shaking at her sides. He saw the white of her knuckles where she gripped what looked like a small silver pocket watch. He saw the blue of her eyes, the color of the cornflowers that grew along the high meadows of the Wind River Range in July, and he understood for the first time why old Hattie Jenkins had ridden a young half-breed boy nearly to death across 140 miles of frozen country in 2 nights. This girl was Edmund Ashcombe's blood. You could see it in the line of her jaw and the way she had lifted her chin even now, even with Crowley's shadow falling across her, even with the smell of fear coming off her like cold breath. Edmund had been a quiet man, but he had been a stubborn man, and the stubborn was sitting right there in the girl's face. Ezekiel saw it, and something inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 5 winters, made a small sound like ice cracking on a thawing pond. He had not come to fall in love with anyone. He had come to settle a debt with the man who had killed his partner. But the cracking had begun all the same. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley recovered himself first. He had not survived 20 years of cattle thievery and land fraud and quiet murder by losing his composure when 4 armed men walked into a room. He took 2 slow steps backward, away from Marigold, smoothing his oiled mustache with the back of one finger, and he produced a smile that did not reach his pale eyes. "Well now," he said, "Mr. Thorncroft, we have not been graced with your company in this town in some years." Ezekiel did not answer. "You are a long way from your mountain, sir." Ezekiel did not answer. "And you have brought your brothers, I see. All 4 of you. To what, may I ask, do we owe the honor?" Ezekiel still did not answer. He walked slowly, the floorboards groaning under his weight, past the staring poker players and the open-mouthed barflies and the piano player who had frozen with his hands above the yellow keys until he was standing beside Marigold Ashcombe at the foot of the stairs. He did not look at her. He did not touch her. He simply placed himself between her and Crowley, and the geometry of the room shifted in that single movement. Behind him, his 3 brothers had moved into the saloon without a word being spoken between them. Years of hunting together had taught them to read each other in silence. Barrett took a position at the front door, his back to the swinging slats, both Colt Navy revolvers still holstered, but his weight forward on the balls of his feet. Cornelius drifted along the long mahogany bar, the heavy Sharps 50 caliber Buffalo rifle still across his arm, his sharp eyes moving from face to face among the 70 men in the room, building himself a map of who would draw and who would run. Josiah did not move at all. Josiah simply stood 3 paces behind Ezekiel in the geometric exact center of the saloon and watched the room with the quiet attention of a man who had once watched his mother die through a crack in a root cellar door and who had decided at age 7 that he would never again take his eyes off a room that contained a man like Crowley. Crowley felt the geometry of it. He had been a powerful man in Bitter Creek for 15 years. Tonight, for the first time in 15 years, he was no longer the most dangerous man in the room. He took a third step backward. Ezekiel finally spoke. "Mayor Crowley, we are here to discharge a debt." Crowley's smile flickered recovered. "Whose debt, sir?" "The debt of Edmund Ashcombe, owed by his niece, Miss Marigold Ashcombe. $5,000, even as I understand it." A murmur ran through the saloon. The men of Bitter Creek had been told all afternoon that the bride was being purchased through a debt of honor. They had not been told that anyone outside the town had any interest in the matter. They certainly had not been told that the Ghost Brothers of the Wind River Range, who had not set foot in Bitter Creek in nearly a decade, had any reason to ride down a mountain in October over a girl from Boston they had never met. Crowley's pale eyes narrowed by a fraction. "And how, Mr. Thorncroft, did you come to know of Miss Ashcombe's circumstances?" "That is not your concern, Mayor." "I think it is." "It is not." Ezekiel did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The sentences came out of him short and flat, the way a man speaks when he has already decided exactly how a conversation is going to end and is only waiting for the other man to catch up. He shrugged the heavy canvas sack off his shoulder. He walked 5 steps forward, past Crowley, past Sheriff Pratt, past the bunting nailed up on the platform, until he was standing at Hattie Jenkins's long mahogany bar. He set the sack on the bar with both hands. He loosened the cord. He upended the sack. What came out of that sack made men in that saloon forget how to breathe. Raw gold spilled across the dark wood. Heavy, irregular nuggets, some the size of a thumb, some the size of a hen's egg. Stamped bullion bars marked with the assayer's punch of a man who had been dead for 6 months. The gold made a sound on the bar that nobody in Bitter Creek had ever heard before, a sound like 100 coins falling into a copper pot. The lamplight caught the metal, and the metal threw the light back yellow and red across the faces of every man in the room. A voice somewhere said, "Sweet Jesus." Another voice said, "That is not possible." Ezekiel did not turn from the bar. He looked at Hattie Jenkins. Hattie was already reaching under the bar for her old brass scale, the same scale her second husband had built for her. 30 years before the scale she had used to weigh dust off 40 different miners over 30 different summers. "Weigh it, Hattie," Ezekiel said. Hattie weighed it. The saloon was silent for a full 2 minutes while she worked. The only sound was the small clink of the brass plates and the soft scrape of nuggets sliding across wood. Crowley stood frozen on the floor behind them, no longer smiling at all. His pale eyes had gone the color of old ice. Hattie finished. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked up at the room and she said in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the saloon, $7,400 in change. By weight, I will swear to it on a Bible if anyone wants to bring me one." Crowley said nothing. Hattie turned to him. "Mayor Crowley, the debt of Edmund Ashcombe to your accounts is $5,000 even. There is on this bar in raw gold the sum of $7,400. The Thorncroft brothers are paying you the debt in full with $2,400 surplus. Do you accept payment, sir, or do you not?" Crowley's mouth worked. He could not seem to make a sound come out. Hattie said louder, "Do you accept payment, sir?" The saloon held its breath. Crowley finally found his voice. It came out thin. "I do not accept payment. The debt was to be settled by marriage, Hattie. The girl signed her name to it." Hattie did not even blink. She reached under her bar and she produced a single sheet of paper. She held it up to the lamplight so the whole room could see it. "This, gentleman, is the contract. The original contract sent to Miss Marigold Ashcombe of Boston, Massachusetts in August of this year. It is signed by Henry Caldwell of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory. Henry Caldwell, gentlemen, is a man who does not exist. There is no Henry Caldwell in this town. There never was. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley used a false name to obtain a young woman's consent to passage to Wyoming. That, sir, is fraud. That is fraud under the laws of the territory and under the laws of the United States. A contract obtained by fraud is no contract at all. The debt is the only legal instrument standing between Miss Ashcombe and her freedom, and the debt has now been paid. She slapped the paper down on the bar next to the gold. In full, with surplus. Crowley's right hand drifted very slowly toward the inside of his coat, where every man in that saloon knew he kept a small ivory-handled revolver. Behind him in the doorway of the Golden Spur Saloon, Bartholomew Thorncroft cleared his throat. It was a small sound, a polite sound almost, the sound a gentleman makes in a parlor when a lady drops a handkerchief. Crowley's hand stopped moving. Barrett spoke for the first time that evening. His voice was lighter than his older brother's, almost amused, but the thing underneath it was not amused at all. Mayor Crowley, I have shot 5 men in my life. I served 2 years with the 7th Cavalry. I was at the greasy grass when Custer rode into the wrong end of a bad afternoon, and I was one of the 7 men under Major Reno who came back down off that hill alive. I have killed men I respected, sir. I have killed men I liked. I have never yet killed a man I did not like, but I am open to the experience. Now, take your hand off the inside of that coat, slowly. Crowley took his hand off the inside of his coat, slowly. Barrett smiled. Thank you, Mayor. The saloon began by degrees to breathe again. Ezekiel turned from the bar at last. He walked back across the warped pine floor to Marigold Ashcombe, who had not moved. She had stood there through every word of it, with her chin up and her father's silver pocket watch white in her fist. Now finally Ezekiel looked her in the eyes for the first time. Up close she was smaller than he had thought from the doorway. The top of her head reached only to the middle of his chest. Her cornflower blue eyes were red-rimmed but dry. He spoke quietly only to her. Miss Ashcombe, we can ride out of this town tonight. You can come with us up to the high country. Hattie has a place for you among us. Or if you choose, we can put you on the next stagecoach east tomorrow with $2,000 in your hand and our word that no man in this room will trouble you on the way. The choice is yours. Nobody is going to make it for you. Not tonight. Not ever again. Marigold looked up at him, up at the great scar that ran down his face, up at the pale eyes, the color of glacier water, that had not once in the whole exchange looked at her with any kind of hunger or possession or claim. Up at the grave courtesy of a man who had just paid $7,400 in raw gold to set her free and was now offering her a stagecoach ticket east. She thought for a long moment. She said, Mr. Thorncroft, I do not know who you are. I do not know why my uncle's name brought you down out of your mountain. I do not know where you mean to take me. But I know that the only person in this room who has shown me a kindness since I stepped off the stage is Hattie Jenkins. And Hattie Jenkins sent for you. Hattie behind the bar made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob. Marigold went on, I will go with you tonight, if you will have me. Ezekiel inclined his head 1 inch. We will have you, Miss Ashcombe. He held out his hand. She placed her small, gloved fingers in his enormous calloused palm. There was a moment then in the Golden Spur Saloon, a moment of perhaps 2 seconds when the entire room understood that something had just shifted in the order of the world. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley had lost his bride. The Thorncroft brothers had ridden down off their mountain. Hattie Jenkins had openly sided against the most powerful man in Bitter Creek. And the young woman in the gray traveling dress, the woman who had walked into the saloon 5 days ago, with 1 trunk and a folded letter, and a prayer, was walking out of it on the arm of a 6'7" mountain man with a grisly scar on his face and $7,400 in raw gold on the bar behind him. The piano player very tentatively played a single chord. He did not know what else to do. Crowley found his voice. You will regret this, girl. Marigold turned her head. She looked at him. She did not flinch. I have already regretted enough things in this life, Mayor Crowley. Threatening you with one more does not frighten me. She walked out of the Golden Spur Saloon on Ezekiel Thorncroft's arm. Barrett held the swinging doors for her. Cornelius brought her trunk down from the upstairs room over one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. Josiah walked behind the youngest brother, the silent one, his eyes still moving over the saloon, watching for any man who might be foolish enough to draw a weapon when their backs were turned. No man in that saloon was foolish enough. Outside the wind, off the Wind River range had risen. The street was dark. Four big mountain horses stood at the hitching rail, breath steaming in the lamplight. A fifth horse stood waiting at the rail beside them, a sturdy, dappled gray mare with a kind eye and a fresh saddle. Hattie Jenkins had purchased her that afternoon at triple the going rate from the livery owner who had complained about the price until Hattie had put a finger in his face and reminded him whose bar he drank at on Saturday nights. Cornelius lashed Marigold's trunk behind the saddle of one of the pack horses. Barrett checked the cinches. Josiah, without a word, went to the dappled gray mare and held the bridle steady, his hand gentle on the velvet of the horse's nose. Ezekiel turned to Marigold. "Miss Ashcombe, have you ridden before?" "Some, sir. Not in winter." "It is not winter yet. It will be by tomorrow night. We have 4 days' hard ride to my cabin. You will ride this gray mare. Her name is Daisy. Josiah will lead her for you the first day until you find your seat. Are you warm enough?" "I am cold, Mr. Thorncroft, but I am alive. I will not complain." He looked down at her in the lamplight. He looked at the silver pocket watch she still gripped in her right hand. He said, "That was your father's." "Yes." Edmund spoke of him. "Your father was a fine man, Miss Ashcombe. So was your uncle. I am sorry for both of your losses. I have not had the chance to tell you that yet." Her eyes filled then finally after all of it, the cold and the threat and the bunting and the gold. She did not let the tears fall. She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." He helped her up onto the gray mare. Josiah took the lead rein. The four brothers swung up onto their own horses in one motion the way men do who have been riding together their whole lives. Hattie Jenkins had come to the door of the Golden Spur Saloon and stood there with her arms crossed against the cold, her iron gray hair loose now around her face. Ezekiel touched the brim of his hat to her. "Hattie." "Zeke, you did well, old woman." "I have been waiting 18 years to do that well, boy. You ride safe. You take care of that child. She is the closest thing to family I have left in this world. Do you hear me?" He nodded. "I hear you. And Hattie, you will not be safe in this town tonight. You know it." "I know it, Zeke. I have known it since the day I sent the boy. I have a wagon waiting in the alley behind the smokehouse. Cousin and Lander will take me in. I will be on the road within the hour. The Golden Spur stands dark from this night forward. Crowley can have the building. He never did own what was inside it." Ezekiel looked at the old woman a long moment. Then he touched his hat brim again. "Lander, then. We will find you when this is finished." "I will be there, boy. I will be there with biscuits, in a kettle, and a good chair. Now go." Hattie turned her head then and looked just for a moment at the silent youngest brother on the dark horse at the rear of the column. Josiah looked back at her steadily. Hattie's eyes in the lamplight suddenly had a wetness to them that the wind had not put there. She said very softly, "Hello, sweet boy." Josiah did not speak, but he raised one gloved hand to the brim of his hat in greeting, and he held it there a moment longer than the gesture required, and Hattie Jenkins put her own hand to her mouth. Twist 2. Folks, you might be wondering why old Hattie Jenkins, 60-year-old proprietor of the Golden Spur Saloon, just looked at the youngest of those four brothers as though she was looking at her own son. Well, sit with that for a minute, because Hattie Jenkins, born Henrietta Hawthorne in 1822, in a homestead 2-day ride from the Thorncroft cabin, was the younger sister of a woman named Mary Hawthorne. And Mary Hawthorne had married a young rancher named Jonathan Thorncroft in 1848. And Mary and Jonathan Thorncroft had 4 little boys. Hattie Jenkins behind that bar was not a stranger to those 4 mountain men. Hattie Jenkins was their aunt. She had been watching over them from a distance from inside Mayor Crowley's own town for 18 years. The 4 brothers and the girl rode out of Bitter Creek at a slow walk. They did not gallop. They did not hurry. Ezekiel Thorncroft was not a man who ran from a town he had just walked into. They went down the muddy main street at a measured pace past the small white church and the livery and the unpainted general store, and behind them the lamps of the Golden Spur saloon burned yellow in the cold. Inside the Golden Spur mare, Thaddeus Crowley stood very still in the middle of the warped pine floor. The 70 men in the room were watching him. He understood with the clarity that comes to powerful men only on the very worst nights of their lives that he had just been publicly humiliated. He understood that the gold on the bar had bought the girl free of any legal claim he could now make against her. He understood that Hattie Jenkins had outwitted him with a piece of paper he had not bothered to track. He understood that the Thorncroft brothers had walked into his town and out of his town without losing so much as a glove. And he understood, perhaps most clearly of all, that if he did not do something tonight to recover his standing in this room, he would lose his grip on Bitter Creek forever, because power was a thing made of nothing but the belief that you had it. He turned to Sheriff Pratt. "Mortimer?" "Yes, Mayor." "Send a rider to One-Eyed Jack Callahan. Have him at my office by tomorrow noon. I want 20 men, hard men. Pinkerton dropouts and Cheyenne shootists. I do not care what they cost. I want them ready to ride for the high country inside of 1 week." "Yes, Mayor." "And Mortimer?" "Yes, Mayor. Find Hattie Jenkins. She has a wagon somewhere in this town. Find her before she leaves Wyoming." Sheriff Pratt swallowed. "Yes, Mayor." But Hattie was already gone. The wagon had pulled out of the alley behind the smokehouse 5 minutes after the brothers rode out of the main street, and the freight driver Hattie had paid in cash 3 days before knew the back roads to Lander as well as any man in the territory. By the time Pratt got to the smokehouse alley, the only thing left was a single tin lantern hanging on a nail and a piece of paper tacked under it. The paper said 3 words in Hattie's heavy hand. "The bar is yours." Underneath those 3 words, she had written 4 more. "So is your soul." Sheriff Pratt read the note twice. Then he folded it and put it inside his vest pocket and walked back toward the saloon to tell the mayor that the old woman had bested them again. Foreshadowing Whisper 3. There are men in this world who lose with grace. Mayor Thaddeus Crowley was not one of them. While the 4 brothers and the girl rode out into the dark of the Wyoming high country, Crowley was already drawing a map in his head. A map of a small valley, a map of a cabin, a map of 4 brothers who by his count would be much easier to kill on their own ground than they had been to kill in his saloon. The mountain men had won the night, but the mountain men had not won the war, and before the spring thaws came to the Wind River Range, that map was going to turn red. The first hour of riding was through the lower country sage and bunch grass under a sky thick with stars. The cold deepened steadily. Marigold sat the gray mare carefully, both hands on the reins. Josiah's lead line a steady tension at the front of the bridle. The mare was kind. She placed her hooves with care. After 30 minutes, Marigold found that she was no longer thinking about how to ride. She was simply riding. She was also thinking. She was thinking about how 6 hours ago she had stood in an upstairs bedroom in the Golden Spur saloon and believed she would be married against her will by morning. She was thinking about how she was now riding through a Wyoming night behind 4 enormous strangers, one of whom had paid more money than her father had earned in his life to set her free of a debt she had not made. She was thinking about the look in Ezekiel Thorncroft's eyes when he had said, "The choice is yours." She was thinking about her Uncle Edmund. After the first hour, Ezekiel signaled a halt at the edge of a creek where the horses could drink. He swung down. His brother swung down. Josiah came around to Marigold's mare and held up his hands to help her dismount, and she allowed it because her legs had gone stiff with cold. Josiah set her on her feet on the frozen grass and steadied her until she had her balance. He did not speak. He simply held her elbow until she was sure of the ground, and then turned away to attend to the horses. Cornelius built a small fire from dry sage and a handful of pine pitch in under 3 minutes. Barrett produced a tin pot and put coffee on. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the firelight and watched the back trail behind them, his Sharps rifle across his arm, until he was satisfied that no riders had followed them out of Bitter Creek. Then he came into the fire and squatted on his heels across from Marigold. Miss Ashcombe, Mr. Thorncroft, you will be tired. We will rest 1 hour. Then we ride until first light. We will make camp in a sheltered draw I know about 30 miles west of here. We will sleep 4 hours. Then we ride again. I understand, sir. He looked at her across the small fire. The flames put a moving orange light on the scar that ran down his face. He seemed to be deciding something. Miss Ashcombe, there are things I must tell you about your uncle, about why we came. I know my uncle did not die in any accident, Mr. Thorncroft. I have known it from the moment Mayor Crowley produced his face in that saloon. A man does not work that hard to own a niece unless he has already taken something from the uncle. Ezekiel's eyes changed at that. Just a small change. The kind a man's face makes when he has just decided that someone is smarter than he had hoped. Edmund was murdered, Miss Ashcombe, by Crowley's men at South Pass 6 months ago because he refused to sign over a piece of paper. What piece of paper? A deed to a tract of land held in a blind trust. The land is in the Badlands south of here. It is on the surface worthless rock. It is not worthless underneath. Your uncle and I were partners, Miss Ashcombe. 3 years ago, I found a vein of quartz so heavy with gold that the rock itself rings like a bell when you strike it with a pick. I could not file the claim under my own name without painting a target on the back of my brothers and myself. Your uncle was the only honest assayer in 500 miles. He filed the claim under a blind trust that names you his only living kin as the inheritor. Marigold sat very still. I am the inheritor of a gold mine. You are the inheritor of perhaps the largest gold strike west of the Black Hills, Miss Ashcombe. And Mayor Thaddeus Crowley has known about that mine for at least 7 months. He has been moving very carefully. He killed your uncle to remove one of the 2 names that needed to consent to any transfer of the deed. He sent for you under a false name to remove the other. If he had succeeded in marrying you tonight by Wyoming territory law, he would have become the legal custodian of all of your property, including the deed to the Badlands claim. He would then have transferred the deed to himself and become overnight perhaps the wealthiest man in the Western Territories. Marigold did not speak for a long time. When she did speak, her voice was lower and harder than it had been in the saloon. Mr. Thorncroft, did you come down off your mountain because of me or because of the gold? The question hung in the firelight. Barrett on the far side of the fire did not look up from his coffee. Cornelius tending the horses did not turn his head. Josiah whittling a stick by the picket line did not move. All 3 of them in their separate silences were waiting to hear how their oldest brother would answer. Ezekiel looked at her across the fire for a long count of 3. He said, I came down because Hattie sent for me. I came down because you are Edmund's blood, and Edmund was my friend, and his blood is owed a debt I will pay until the day I die. I came down because no man in this country deserves to be sold across a saloon floor to Thaddeus Crowley. I did not come down for the gold, Miss Ashcombe. I have lived 20 years on a mountain with my brothers, and we have what we need. The gold is yours, every ounce of it. The deed will be put into your name in Cheyenne the moment we can get to a federal land office. I will sign whatever papers a court requires me to sign to make that fact plain. And what do you want from me in return, sir? Nothing, Miss Ashcombe. Nothing. Nothing that you do not freely give. I want you to live. I want you to be free. If you choose when this business is finished to take your inheritance and ride east to Boston and never see any of us again, I will put you on that train myself with a kiss on the back of your hand and my blessing. If you choose to stay in the territory and build a home of your own, I will help you build it. If you choose in the fullness of time and with no one rushing you to consider any one of my brothers or myself as a man, you might walk through the rest of your life beside then. We will speak of that when the time comes. But not before. You have been bargained over enough for one lifetime, Miss Ashcombe. You will not be bargained over by me. Marigold's eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She pressed both of her gloved hands to her mouth for a moment, and she breathed through her fingers, and when she lowered her hands again, she was steadier. Mr. Thorncroft, I do not know what to say to that. You do not need to say anything, Miss Ashcombe. Drink your coffee. We have a long ride. She drank her coffee. The fire burned low. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly in the coal-black sky. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once and went silent. After perhaps 20 minutes, Marigold spoke again, quietly. Mr. Thorncroft. Yes, there is a fourth brother, the youngest. He has not spoken since we left town. No, he does not generally. Is he well? Ezekiel looked across the fire at Josiah, who was still whittling, his head bent over his knife. Josiah was 7 years old, Miss Ashcombe, in the autumn of 1864. On the night, a band of riders hired by a young Thaddeus Crowley came to our parents' homestead. They killed my father in the yard. They killed my mother in the kitchen. Hattie's sister. My brothers and I were hidden in the root cellar, all four of us, by my mother. She told us not to come out no matter what we heard. We did as we were told. Josiah was 7. He has not spoken a full sentence aloud since that night. He understands every word you say. He reads better than I do. He hears the wind a mile off. But the part of a boy that learns to talk over a fire, that part of him was buried in our mother's kitchen on a night in 1864. He has not in 18 years found it again. Marigold's hand was at her mouth again. Crowley. He was 37 years old then, Miss Ashcombe. He wanted our father's land. Our father would not sell. Crowley sent 4 riders. We did not know it was Crowley until 2 years ago, when your uncle hired a Pinkerton detective named James Holloway to look into it. Holloway sent his report to Edmund. Holloway is dead now. Edmund is dead now. The report sits in a strong box under the floorboards of my cabin, and Crowley has spent 3 years and a great deal of money trying to find that strong box. Tonight, Miss Ashcombe Crowley understood for the first time that we are not after all 4 hermits on a mountain. We are 4 men who came down out of that mountain when called, and we walked into his saloon, and we walked out with his bride. He poured the last of his coffee onto the fire. The fire hissed and went down to embers. He will come for us now. How soon? Inside of 2 months, maybe sooner. He will hire Shootist out of Cheyenne. He will bring numbers. He will bring weapons we have not seen in this country before. He has the money to bring whatever he wishes. What will you do? We will go home, Miss Ashcombe. We will go home to the Hawthorne Valley, and we will get ready. Hook closing part 2. Now, folks, while those 4 brothers and that one girl mounted up at the embers of their little sage fire and rode west into the deep cold of the Wyoming high country, while the stars wheeled overhead and the dappled gray mare named Daisy carried Marigold Ashcombe step by careful step toward a valley nobody had ever named on a map, while the coyotes called, and the night thickened, and Josiah Thorncroft rode silent at the rear of the column, with one hand always near the long knife at his belt. Back in Bitter Creek, a yellow telegraph window was burning late in the office of Sheriff Mortimer Pratt. A wire was being sent. The wire was going to Cheyenne. The wire said to a certain dangerous man who had 3 notches on his pistol grip and only one good eye that there was $20,000 waiting for him in Bitter Creek if he could be there inside of 8 days with 20 hard men. The mountain had won the saloon, but the mountain was about to be invited to a war it had not yet declared, and the war was coming up the Sweetwater Trail with the wind. The first night out of Bitter Creek was the hardest, not because of the cold, though the cold was a living thing that pressed on a person from every direction at once. Not because of the dark, though the dark of the Wyoming high country in October was a kind of dark that a woman from Boston had never imagined possible. The first night was the hardest because Marigold Ashcombe, riding behind 4 men she did not know into a country she had never seen, had only just begun to understand how completely her life had changed. She had ridden for an hour after they left the embers of the sage fire, then another hour, then another. The dappled gray mare named Daisy walked steadily, sure-footed as a goat, And after the third hour, Marigold's hands stopped gripping the reins so tight and began simply resting on them. Josiah Thorncroft rode at her side, leading her mare on a slack lead line, his dark eyes scanning the country ahead and behind in a slow rhythm that did not change. The brothers did not speak. Mountain men, she would learn, did not waste words on trail at night. The horses' hooves on the frozen ground made a soft drumming. Leather creaked. A snaffle bit jingled now and again. The wind moved through the bunch grass with a sound like the slow turning of a long page. They rode until the false dawn began to gray the eastern sky. Then Ezekiel raised one gloved hand and turned his big bay gelding off the trail into a sheltered draw between two long sandstone ridges, and the horses who knew this draw and had drunk from this creek 100 times before walked themselves down to the water without being told. "Camp here," Ezekiel said. It was the first word any of them had spoken in 4 hours. Cornelius dismounted and went up the side of the draw to set a watch on the high ground. Barrett dropped his saddle, stripped his horse, picketed it on a long line, and started a fire in a ring of stones that had clearly been used by the brothers many times before. Josiah came around to Marigold's mare and held up his hands to her, and she leaned forward and let herself fall sideways into his arms, because her legs would not have held her if she had tried to dismount on her own. He set her on her feet gently. She staggered. He steadied her at the elbow. He did not let her go until he was sure she could stand. "Thank you," she said. His dark eyes met hers gravely, and he raised one hand to the brim of his hat. Then he turned away to attend to her saddle. Ezekiel came over with a wool blanket. He laid it over her shoulders without ceremony. "Miss Ashcombe, sit by the fire. Barrett will have coffee in 5 minutes. There is dried venison in my saddlebag and biscuits Hattie packed for us. Eat what you can. We sleep 4 hours." "Where will I sleep, sir?" "On that side of the fire. The 4 of us will sleep on this side. Josiah will take the second watch. You will not be disturbed, Miss Ashcombe. You have my word." She sat down on the wool blanket close to the fire. Her hands were so cold she could not feel her fingers. She held them out to the flames and watched the blood come back into them slowly. She looked across the fire at the 4 brothers, who were her unlikely guardians now, and she tried to set them straight in her mind. Ezekiel the oldest, 32, the scar, the pale eyes the color of glacier ice, the voice that did not waste a word. Bartholomew called Barrett, 30, the lighter manner, the 2 Colt Navy revolvers, the eyes that sometimes did not see what was in front of them, the small tremor in his left hand when he reached for a spoon. Cornelius called Neil, 27, slender as a willow whip, the best tracker any of them had. The man who she had noticed in the saloon never made a sound when he moved, not even on warped pine boards. Josiah called Joss, 25, the silent one, the youngest, the boy who had been 7 years old in a root cellar in 1864, the man who had spoken his first word in 18 years on a ridge above Bitter Creek the night before. He had said, just the one word, Otgenin. 4 men, 4 mountains in their own way, 4 brothers who had ridden 140 miles to set her free and who had not once in all of the riding looked at her with anything but courtesy. She drank her coffee. She ate 2 biscuits and a strip of venison. Then she lay down on the blanket on her side of the fire, and she pulled a second blanket Barrett had handed her up over her shoulders. And despite the cold and the strange country and the 4 armed men sleeping on the other side of the embers, she fell asleep within the space of a breath. When she woke 4 hours later, Josiah was sitting on a log a few feet from her with the heavy Sharps 50 caliber rifle across his knees. He had been there the whole time. He had not slept. The sun was just over the eastern ridge. He saw her open her eyes. His mouth moved in something that was almost but not quite a smile. Then he got up and went to wake his brothers. Foreshadowing whisper 4. Folks, I want you to remember Josiah Thorncroft sitting on that log in the gray light of an October morning. Remember that he has not slept. Remember that he is the silent one, the youngest, the boy who lost his speech to a kitchen full of men with guns when he was 7 years old. Remember it? Because in a few weeks' time, on a different gray morning, in a far worse situation, the silent youngest brother is going to do something that the other three Thorncroft men have none of them ever heard him do. And it is going to break a piece of every one of them in the breaking. The second day of riding was easier than the first. Marigold's body was sore in places. She had not known a body could be sore, but the sun came up clean and cold, and the country opened around them into long sage flats with the dark blue line of the Wind River Range rising ahead like a wall at the edge of the world. The brothers rode in their formation, Ezekiel at Point Barrett at Second Marigold, and Josiah together in the middle, Cornelius at the rear, leading the two pack horses. Around mid-morning, Cornelius rode up alongside Marigold's gray mare. He was the only one of the four who had not yet spoken to her. He rode with the easy slouch of a man who had spent 20 years in the saddle and who could fall asleep in it if he chose. He grinned at her sideways. It was a quick grin, almost shy. "Miss Ashcombe, Mr. Thorncroft." "I will not answer to Mr. Ma'am. None of us will in time. Call me Neil." "Neil, that mare is treating you right." "She is. She is the kindest horse I have ever ridden. She is a good mare. Joss picked her out. Joss has an eye for a horse the way some men have an eye for a woman. He saw that mare in the Bitter Creek livery 6 months ago, and he came home and he told me, well, he wrote me a note about her, said the gray mare in the Bitter Creek livery had a kind eye and was worth keeping an eye on. We bought her last week. Hattie put her on the books for us so as not to draw attention. Joss said yesterday morning that the mare was meant for you." Marigold turned her head. "Yesterday morning, before he had ever seen me, before any of us had ever seen you, ma'am." Cornelius grinned again and rode on ahead to scout the next rise. Marigold looked sideways at the silent young man riding beside her. Josiah was watching the ground ahead, his profile calm. He had heard the whole exchange. He did not turn his head, but the corner of his mouth just for a moment curved in the smallest hint of a smile. Twist 3. Folks hear that. The brothers had bought the mare a week before they ever knew Marigold Ashcombe existed. That is not coincidence. That is the kind of thing the high country does to men who have lived close to it long enough. The mountain knew her name before they did. Joss, in his silence, had been the first one to hear the wind say it. Around noon, they crossed a frozen creek at a wide gravel ford. The water was running thin under a crust of clear black ice. The horses crossed carefully. On the far side, while they were pausing to let the animals drink, Ezekiel rode back to Marigold and held out a folded piece of canvas. "Miss Ashcombe, the wind off the range will be harder this afternoon. Put this on under your coat." She unfolded the canvas. It was a thick wool shirt, soft and well-made size for a small man. It was clean and it smelled faintly of cedar. "This is yours, sir." It was. "It will fit you better than it ever fit me." She put it on under her dress coat and immediately felt the difference. The wind that had been cutting through her ribs all morning suddenly had something to push against. She closed her eyes for a second in pure animal gratitude. When she opened them, Ezekiel had already turned his bay and ridden back to the head of the column. The third day was harder. They had begun to climb in earnest. The trail wound up through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen whose leaves had already gone gold and were falling now in slow yellow showers around the riders' shoulders. The air thinned, the cold deepened. By mid-afternoon, when they crossed an exposed shoulder of rock at perhaps 8,000 feet, the wind hit them with a force that took Marigold's breath away. The gray mare set her shoulder into it and pushed forward without missing a step. It was on the third afternoon that the mountain lion came. They had stopped to rest the horses in a small clearing in a stand of old spruce. Ezekiel was checking a hoof on the lead pack horse. Barrett had walked off into the trees to relieve himself. Cornelius was kneeling by the trail, studying something on the frozen ground that none of the others would have noticed in a year of looking. Marigold was standing with her hand on Daisy's neck. Josiah was 10 feet away from her, adjusting the latigo on his own horse's saddle. Without warning, Josiah went absolutely still. Marigold did not see what he saw, but she felt the change in the air around him the way an animal feels a storm coming. He turned his head a fraction of an inch. He looked past her up into the dark crown of a spruce tree behind her shoulder. His right hand very slowly moved to the long knife at his belt. He raised his left hand. He laid one finger across his lips. He looked her in the eyes, quiet his eyes said. She did not move. He stepped soundless across the frozen ground between them. He came up beside her. He took her elbow in his left hand, gently. He drew her one step at a time, sideways away from the tree behind her and toward the gray mare. He never took his eyes off whatever was in that tree. Cornelius, 20 feet away, looked up from the ground. He saw his youngest brother's face. He went still as well. His Winchester came off his back into his hands without a sound. Ezekiel, still bent over the pack horse's hoof, said quietly without raising his head, "What?" Josiah did not answer. He could not answer. But he gestured two fingers down to the spruce. Cornelius brought the Winchester up to his shoulder smoothly. He sighted. He waited. There was a long moment of absolute silence. Then a shape exploded out of the spruce above and behind Marigold. A streak of tawny gold, a long whipping tail, four legs gathered in midair. A mountain lion easily 150 pounds dropping from a branch, perhaps 15 feet up. Cornelius fired once. The cat hit the ground 3 feet from where Marigold had been standing. It was already dead. Cornelius's bullet had gone in behind the left shoulder and through the heart. Marigold made a small sound, a single soft gasp. She did not scream. Josiah's hand was still on her elbow. He had not let go of her. His other hand was on the hilt of the long knife. The long knife was halfway out of its sheath. The mountain lion would have landed on her shoulders. It would have broken her neck before she hit the ground. Cornelius's rifle had killed the cat in the air, but Josiah's hand on her elbow had moved her 2 paces sideways in the seconds before the cat jumped, and those 2 paces were why the cat had fallen short. Ezekiel had come up at a run. He looked at the dead cat. He looked at his youngest brother. He looked at Marigold. Then he looked at the spruce tree. "Joss, how did you know?" Josiah did not speak. Of course he did not speak. He simply pointed up into the spruce. There on a high branch, half hidden in the dark green, was a single tuft of tawny fur caught on a twig where the cat had brushed it, climbing up an hour before. Ezekiel let out his breath. Lord. Barrett came running back from the trees, buttoning his coat, a Colt Navy already in his hand. He saw the dead cat. He saw his brother standing close. He saw Marigold, pale as paper but unhurt. He holstered his pistol slowly. "Well," Barrett said, "Joss earned his supper." Cornelius walked over and put a hand on Josiah's shoulder. He squeezed once. He did not say anything. The brothers did not generally speak about the things that mattered most. Marigold looked at the silent young man whose hand was still on her elbow. She said very quietly, "Joss, thank you." Josiah looked down at her. His dark eyes were calm. His mouth softened a fraction at the corner. Then he let go of her elbow. Then he did something none of the other 3 brothers had ever seen him do for a stranger. He raised his right hand and made a small gesture in the air between them. He touched 2 fingers to his own chest, then to his lips, then opened his hand towards her palm up. Marigold did not know what the gesture meant, but Cornelius did. He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "What was that?" Marigold asked. Cornelius said, "That, ma'am, is sign talk. Old Hank Birchwood taught us all of it when we were boys. It is what hunters use when they cannot speak. Joss said, 'My heart, my words are yours.'" Marigold's eyes filled. She steadied them with a slow breath. There was no time for crying in this country. The cat lay dead 3 feet away. The cat could have been her. She would weep perhaps when she was alone, but she lifted her own hand, awkwardly. She did not know the gestures. She touched 2 fingers to her chest, then to her own lips, then opened her hand toward Josiah, palm up. Josiah's eyes changed. He inclined his head 1 inch, the way his oldest brother did, and then he turned away, to skin the mountain lion because skinning the mountain lion was what needed to be done next, and the Thorncroft brothers, in moments of feeling, generally turned to the next thing that needed doing. Hook moment 3. Folks, listen to me. That moment, that small exchange of a few fingers in the cold air over a dead mountain lion, was the first conversation Marigold Ashcombe ever had with the youngest of the four Thorncroft brothers. And it was the most important conversation any of them would have on the road to the Hawthorne Valley. Because Josiah Thorncroft, who had not spoken for 18 years, had just told a young woman from Boston that his heart and his words belonged to her. Not as a husband, not as a suitor, as a brother, as a guardian, as a fourth wall around her in a country full of wolves. And Marigold Ashcombe, Boston bred, who knew nothing of sign talk or mountain lions or root cellars or the way silent men love, had answered him correctly without knowing the language. There are things in this world that do not require translation. That night by the fire, after the cat had been skinned and the camp made and the stew of fresh meat eaten in silence, Josiah did one more thing. He came over to where Marigold sat with her cup of coffee on the wool blanket. He squatted on his heels in front of her. His dark eyes were steady, and in that voice rusted from 18 years of silence, the second sentence of his adult life, he said two words: stay close. Then he stood up and walked away to take the first watch. Marigold sat by the fire with the cup steaming in her hands. Across the embers, Ezekiel was watching her. Their eyes met. Neither of them said anything, but something passed between them in the small silence that would not later need to be put into words. The fourth day of riding, the last day, was the worst and the best. The worst because the country had grown brutal, narrow ledge trails with frozen scree falling away to the right switchbacks, where the mare had to gather herself and lunge two sections, where the brothers led the horses on foot, single file, along a path so narrow that Marigold could not look down without dizziness. The best because the country had also grown beautiful in a way she had not believed country could grow. The Wind River Range opened its high places to her one valley at a time. They climbed past timberline. They crossed an alpine meadow where the wind had scoured the snow away and left the dry brown grass standing up like wires. They passed a half-frozen lake, the color of melted turquoise. They came around a long shoulder of granite at mid-afternoon, and there below them suddenly lay the Hawthorne Valley. She drew breath. It was not what she had expected. She had been picturing somewhere in the back of her mind a steep rock fissure with a one-room cabin shoved into it, smoke leaking out of a chimney, a place where four hard men lived hard lives. What lay below her instead was a hidden bowl in the mountains, perhaps 2 miles long and a mile wide. A clear lake at its center, half frozen at the edges, the open water in the middle the color of a very deep blue evening sky. A waterfall coming down off a granite cliff at the lake's far end in 3 slow white ropes, dark stands of spruce on the slopes, a long meadow on the near shore, the dry grass golden in the afternoon light. And at the meadow's edge, sheltered by the cliff and looking out across the water, a building. It was not a cabin, it was a lodge, built of peeled lodgepole pine logs, 2 full stories with a steep cedar shake roof and a stone chimney at each end. Smoke was rising from one of the chimneys. There was a long covered porch facing the water. There was a separate barn behind it, and a corral, and what looked like a smokehouse and a spring house and a small forge. Marigold sat the gray mare on the high ridge above the valley and stared. Ezekiel beside her on his bay did not say anything. He let her look. After a long minute, she said, "Mr. Thorncroft." "Zeke, I think we are past Mr. "Zeke, that is not a trapper's lean-to." "No, ma'am." "Did you build that?" "Most of it. Barrett did the stonework. Cornelius did the cedar shakes. Joss carved every door and window frame in that lodge by hand. We have been at it for 9 years. It is the most beautiful house I have ever seen in my life. It is home, Miss Ashcombe." "Marigold, I think we are past Miss Ashcombe." He glanced at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction. "Marigold." They rode down off the ridge. The descent took an hour. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun had dropped behind the western cliffs, and the air had gone the deep blue of a winter dusk. Lamps were already lit inside the lodge. The smell of wood smoke and something else, a stew of some kind, came across the meadow on the still air. Old Hank Birchwood was waiting on the porch. He was a small, dry man, perhaps 75 years old, leather-faced and white-bearded, with a buffalo hide coat that fell to his knees and a battered Hawken rifle leaning beside him against the wall. He had been the brothers' guardian since 1864. He had taught Cornelius to track, had taught Barrett to shoot, had taught Ezekiel to skin a deer in under 3 minutes, had taught Josiah in the long, quiet years when Josiah did not speak every gesture of the old hunter sign talk. Hank had ridden up from his own small cabin 2 valleys west when he had heard the brothers were riding to Bitter Creek. He had been holding the lodge for them. He stepped down off the porch as they came into the yard. He was grinning under his white beard. "Well now," Hank said, "you boys did not leave any of yourselves behind in town." "No, sir," Ezekiel said. "And you brought the lady." "We brought the lady." Hank came up to the gray mare. He took off his old wool hat. He tipped his head to Marigold. "Miss Ashcombe." "Sir." "My name is Hank Birchwood, ma'am. I have been waiting on you. I know you have had a long ride, and I imagine you have had a longer week before that. Supper is on. Bathwater is hot. There is a room upstairs Joss built for you over the last 6 months." She looked down at him. 6 months. 6 months, ma'am. But Hank looked up at her with kind, faded eyes. "Hattie wrote us in April, ma'am, the day after your uncle was found dead. She said there was a niece in Boston with no family living. She said she did not know what was going to happen yet, but she wanted us to know there was a girl. The boys started building a room the next week. Did not know if you would ever come up this mountain. Did not know if you would even be alive to come. But they built the room anyway." Joss carved the door. Marigold pressed both hands to her mouth and held them there, and let the cold air come and go through her fingers until she could trust her voice again. 6 months. 6 months, ma'am. Twist 4. Folks, sit a minute with what old Hank Birchwood just said on the porch of a lodge in the high country in October of 1882. The Thorncroft brothers had not come down off their mountain to rescue Marigold Ashcombe because Hattie wrote them 3 lines on a piece of brown paper 2 nights before. They had been preparing for her arrival for 6 months. From the moment Edmund's body was found at South Pass, those 4 brothers had begun building a room in their lodge for a young woman in Boston they had never met, on the chance that they might one day be called upon to bring her home. That is not a rescue. That is a vow. That is a vow taken in silence by 4 men in a lodge in the mountains, the way men take their deepest vows. And Marigold Ashcombe, sitting on a kind gray mare in the blue dusk of the Hawthorne Valley, was understanding for the first time that she had not, after all, been bargained over and won. She had been waited for. Cornelius came up and held the mare's bridle. Barrett came up and lifted Marigold down out of the saddle. Her legs would not hold her. Barrett did not comment on it. He simply, in one easy motion, scooped her up the way he might have scooped up a child, and he carried her up the porch steps, across the porch, and through the front door of the lodge. Ezekiel followed. Josiah and Cornelius led the horses around to the barn. Old Hank held the door. The inside of the lodge took her breath a second time. A great room with a stone fireplace, 8 feet wide at the far end, buffalo hide rugs on the plank floor, a long pine table set for 6 with tin plates and pewter mugs, an iron stew pot bubbling on a hook over the fire, smelling of venison and onions and wild sage. To the left, against the entire long wall, floor to ceiling, packed shelves of books, hundreds of books, leather-bound cloth bound some new, most well-worn. To the right, a heavy oak desk with rolled topographical maps and brass drafting instruments. Above the fireplace, a violin and a wall mount. Beside the fireplace, a low bookshelf full of small carved wooden figures of animals, the kind a man whittles by lamplight when he cannot sleep. Marigold in Barrett's arms looked at all of it. She said, "You 4 are not mountain men. You are something else. Barrett laughed. It was the first real laugh she had heard from him, and we are mountain men, Marigold. We are just not perhaps what some folks expect. He set her down carefully on a long couch covered in a buffalo robe in front of the fire. He laid a wool blanket over her legs. He brought her a tin cup of hot chicory coffee with cream and sugar, real cream from a goat Hank kept in a stall behind the barn, real sugar from a tin jar on the kitchen shelf. She took the cup in both hands and held it under her face and breathed the steam. The brothers came in one by one, Cornelius and Josiah smelling of horse and cold air. Old Hank with his Hawken rifle leaned against the wall. Ezekiel, who had stopped to put the 4 horses away with his own hands, came in last and shut the heavy front door behind him against the cold. The 5 men sat down to supper with Marigold at the head of the long table. Old Hank said grace. It was a short grace, the kind a hunter says, thanking the country for what the country had given. Then they ate. She ate 3 bowls of the stew. She had not eaten properly in 5 days. She ate biscuits in butter and a small slab of pan bread. Old Hank had pulled hot from the iron stove. She drank her coffee. The brothers talked the easy, low-voiced talk of men who had not all been together at a table in some time. Barrett told a story about a bear he had encountered the previous week. Cornelius described briefly and with great accuracy the route they had ridden out of Bitter Creek. Old Hank reported dryly that the goat had been difficult to milk in their absence. Josiah did not speak, but he ate slowly, and once when Marigold reached for the salt, he passed it to her without being asked, and his fingers brushed hers for a half-second. Ezekiel mostly listened. He sat at the foot of the table and watched the firelight moving on the faces of his brothers and the woman they had brought home, and the thing in his chest that had cracked open in the saloon was now widening by slow degrees into something he did not yet have a name for. After supper, while Hank was washing the dishes and the brothers had stepped out to settle the horses for the night, Marigold found herself alone with Ezekiel by the fire. She was looking at the violin above the mantel, then at the carved wooden figures, then at the great stone fireplace. Her eyes finally went to a small, framed daguerreotype on the bookshelf, partly turned away from the room. She did not ask, but Ezekiel saw where she was looking. Catherine Wells, he said quietly, of Philadelphia. We were engaged in 1877. I came west to survey a rail line. The bear took most of my face out near Yellowstone that summer. When I went home in the fall with the bandages still on, she met me in her father's parlor. She told me she was sorry. She told me she could not look at me. She had already accepted the proposal of a banker by the time my train pulled in. Marigold did not speak. She did not say she was sorry. She did not offer the easy comfort that women are taught to offer in such moments. Instead, she stood up. She walked across the buffalo rug to the bookshelf. She picked up the small frame, turned it gently to face the room, and set it back down where it had been. A scar is only a story written on the skin, she said. I am not afraid to read yours. Ezekiel did not answer. He could not for a moment find his voice. The thing in his chest that had cracked open in the saloon that had widened over supper made another small movement now and settled into something close to a name. He was not ready to say the name yet, but it was there. When the brothers and Hank came back inside, Marigold had returned to the buffalo robe couch and was sitting with her knees drawn up under the blanket, and Ezekiel was at his desk in the corner of the great room. He opened a drawer. He took out a folded square of waxed parchment. He brought it to Marigold. He laid the parchment on her lap. This is yours, he said. It has been yours since April. I am only the man who has been holding it for you. She unfolded it. It was a deed, filed under a blind trust held by Edmund Ashcombe, deceased in naming as sole inheritor, one Marigold Catherine Ashcombe of Boston, Massachusetts. The deed was for one tract of land, 1,240 acres in the Badlands, south of the Wind River Range, comprising the entirety of the strike known privately to the partners as the Hawthorne Vein. Across the bottom in Edmund Ashcombe's careful copperplate hand was a small notation. For my niece, with my love, so she shall never want. She steadied her breath. She had not wept in the saloon, or on the trail, or in the spruce stand, when the cat had jumped, or on the porch when old Hank had told her about the room. She did not weep now either. She simply folded the deed back along its old creases and laid it on her knee and put both her hands flat on top of it. She said, Zeke, yes, Mayor Crowley is going to come up this mountain. Yes, he is. How long do we have? 2 months, maybe less. Hattie will get word to us when his men start to gather in Bitter Creek. Even from Lander, she will know. Are we going to be ready? He looked at her across the firelight. For the first time since she had met him in the saloon, his eyes had something soft in them, something that was not soft at the edges, something that was soft only at the very center where it counted. He said, we have been getting ready for 18 years, Marigold. We have just been waiting on you. She nodded once. She closed her hand around the deed. Outside the lodge, in the great cold dark of the Hawthorne Valley, a wolf called once far away. A second wolf answered. The wind moved through the lodgepole pines on the slopes above the lake. The half-frozen water at the edges of the lake creaked and settled. And down in Bitter Creek, 2 days of hard riding to the east in the back office of the Golden Spur Saloon, a man with 3 notches on his pistol grip and only one good eye was sitting at a table with Mayor Thaddeus Crowley, counting out the front half of a $20,000 fee. Hook Closing Part 3. Folks, the road to the Hawthorne Valley was 4 days long. It carried Marigold Ashcombe out of a saloon and into a lodge. It carried her through cold and mountain lion and starlight. It carried her into a country where 4 men had already built her a room and named her a horse and waited for her name to come up the trail on the wind. But the road that One-Eyed Jack Callahan was about to ride was a different road. That road was going to come up the same trail in 2 months' time in the deep heart of January in snow. Up to the horses' bellies with 20 hard men, an ivory-handled revolver, and a Gatling gun strapped to the back of a mule. The Hawthorne Valley had taken in its own. The Hawthorne Valley was about to learn all over again what it cost to keep them.